Each year, the governor and the legislature set forth the upcoming year's priorities through the state budget. Unlike in years past, however, this year's state finances are shaping up to have a budget surplus. The infusion of new revenue has changed the debate, from a discussion of what programs to cut to whether a growing surplus should be used to restore those cuts or retire the state's debts. But is the current projected surplus something we can take to the bank? What does the state's near and long-term budget picture actually look like? We'll ask Mac Taylor, the leader of the state's nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, or the LAO. The current California budget surplus, trick or treat?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From the California Channel at the state capitol, Valley PBS, and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Our guest is Mac Taylor, the California's legislative analyst and the state's leading authority in the budget. Welcome back to the Maddy Report, Mac.
Nice to be back, Mark.
So generally, how does the state budget look over the next couple of years?
Well, you know, I've been on this show during the really bad years of 2008 to 2012, so it's nice to come on when the state's budget situation is in much better shape.
I remember when we were talking about this a few years ago, and you were saying that you saw $20 billion deficits as far as the eye could see.
They were even higher than that. So I'm glad to report that the budget is in much better shape. Our spending is generally in line with incoming revenues, and there's actually money left over to build up reserves and continue to pay off some of the debts that we've incurred. So it's a much, much better situation than we've seen in a long time.
So you're actually projecting a surplus, aren't you?
Yes, although it really goes to how we build our forecast. We just came out with a report that we put out every November.
Let me get a little plug here for the LAO. If you want to know about what's going on in the state budget, I strongly encourage you to go on the website and take a look at their reports. They're very well done.
And this was our Fiscal Outlook, in which we sort of the kicking off point for the next budget season, the 2015-16 budget that will begin next July 1. And it's very important, the assumptions that we make in giving those numbers.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
What we do is basically, we assume that the current commitments that the legislature has made, its spending commitments, continue on in the near future.
There's a subtle point you're trying to, I think, make here, and that is no new commitments.
That's right, and it's not to say there shouldn't be any commitments, it's just that that's for the legislature and the governor to decide. All we can do is say, well, if you continue your current spending sort of practices, and you take our revenue estimates, these are the numbers that would result from that.
It's interesting when you said that, because I was doing a little research and I found that Senate President Pro Tem Kevin De Leon said the legislature needs to, quote, make prudent and wise investments to continue building the state's economic strength, which sounds to me like they may want to be adding some things in the budget, but this is a balancing act.
Exactly, and what the purpose of our report is to kind of give them the lay of the land and show them what do they have to play with. Are their numbers in balance? Can they add new spending commitments, or do they need to cut back on others? And it just depends on some key decisions that they'll have to make.
And a lot of times it seems like when you're looking at the budget, a big source of the revenue, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, is our personal income taxes, and a big source of that are capital gains, which are highly volatile. It's kind of hard to predict.
They're very hard to predict. Certainly in the near term, we know that markets are at an all-time high, and we would expect very good capital gain numbers, and we've been seeing that. And so you can expect revenues to be doing very well given where the markets are. But that can turn around really quickly.
Anybody who has a 403B and has stuff invested in the market, those few years that were great, and then it dips down, and then it's good again, realizes how volatile the market can be.
And it's a big part of our revenue structure.
Yeah. Well, Prop 98 is the state's constitutional funding guarantee for schools. And the way it's calculated, the way I understand it is, the higher state revenues are, the more goes to school funding. What does that mean for the upcoming budget?
Well, it is complicated because on average schools get about 40% of the total budget, but at the margin they can get a lot more or a lot less. It kind of depends on where you are. In the current fiscal year, for example, we're estimating that the state is going to have $2 billion more than we thought we were going to have this year when the budget was passed. Now, interestingly enough, we estimate that all of that money will go to schools just because of the way that we are implementing the formulas. So even though all of the groups out there probably think well, there's more money for us, all of it's going to schools, which is great for schools, but there's really not money left over for other spending commitments or to build up reserves.
Yeah, I think I've heard it described, the formula, a Prop 98 formula, as something akin to the Winchester Mystery House.
Well, it is a little bit like that. It's there are lots of different formulas that we've had different interpretations of them, and it's very unintuitive. So you really just have to play through the numbers and see what they spit out.
People have said that there are a few people who designed Prop 98 have actually put their kids through college explaining Prop 98. So your report says that there's going to be a $4.2 billion reserve in 15-16. How did you arrive at that conclusion?
Well, and again, what we said is at the end of 15-16, if all of those assumptions we talked about, if our revenue estimates come about, and you just stick with your current spending commitments, this is what would be at the end. The end result of that, you would have $4.2 billion in reserves that you could use to cushion any future downfalls. Now again, we're not predicting that that's what the state will have, because as you say, some people want to spend more. So I think that really points to the key issue. Is $4.2 billion enough in reserves? If it is, and you want to spend more, then you have to make some adjustments elsewhere. If you think it's too much, you don't need that much money in reserves, then you can make additional spending commitments without making other decisions.
I think a lot of people, it's interesting, a million here, a million there.
Yeah.
To most regular folks, that's a lot of money. But for the state budget, it's not. And we're talking about, how big is the state budget? Put it in context.
The general fund budget is about $108 billion. So we're talking about less than 4% if you kept that 4.2. It's a lot of money. But think about your own personal finances, how easy it is for something to swing, and a 4% reserve is not bad. But given how volatile our revenue structure is, I'm not sure that's enough.
It's interesting, a lot of companies want to keep a reserve of 5 to 10% for those rainy days, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But up next, we're going to talk about the impact of the improving economy on state revenues. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. So as the economy goes, so goes state revenues. So what is the state of the state's economy going forward? We're talking to Mac Taylor, head of the nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst Office. So as you analyze future state revenues, what are the overall trends you're projecting for the United States generally and for California specifically?
Well, both pretty similar, and they have been for the last 2 or 3 years. As we've come out of the recession, we've had basically fairly moderate growth. We've never had that sort of gangbuster year that we might have in past recessions where you pop back really quickly and have very rapid increases in personal income and revenues. So we've had sort of moderate growth.
So when you say moderate growth, it's been running, what, 4%?
Well, personal income, and it's a notion that's used for state. That's most of your economy is what people earn. Maybe growing at 4.5%.
And when you say robust, as in
could
other...
be 7 or 8 or 9% in some years coming out of recessions.
Okay.
So we're doing fine. It's sort of moderate growth, and we're actually forecasting in the next couple of years it will accelerate, get a little bit faster. But in general, continued moderate growth at both the United States level and at California's level.
Now, you were saying, I think in your report, that this is the 6th year of an expansion. How long do expansions usually last?
About 5 to 6 years,
okay,
on average.
Heads up.
On average, and again, we're not forecasting that we are going to turn down in the very near future. There's still slack in the economy. Unemployment is still relatively high, particularly in the Central Valley.
Right.
So we think that the economy still has room to grow, but it is a warning sign when you think about the state's budgetary situation of why it's so important to build up reserves in anticipation of some downturn in the future.
You just think about that in the stock market. It's been going up and up and up, and
all-time highs.
right. People think it's going to go on forever. Just like the housing, a lot of people thought the housing market would continue, and of course it didn't. Well, one area, speaking of which, where the economy really took a hit was in housing during the recession. What do you see as the trends now in housing in California?
The last couple of years, prices have really rebounded, primarily in the coastal areas, but basically throughout the state. They've grown very rapidly, in fact. And you would think that generally when you have high prices, it's a strong signal to home builders that we would be having a sort of a burst of construction. And that's typically a very important contributor to economic growth. That's one of the reasons why you can bounce back very quickly.
And just explain that, the reason why
Well,
is?
You build houses, not only do you get that boost of putting construction workers and people back to work, what happens when someone moves into a new house?
You need a refrigerator.
You need the appliances, the carpeting, the furniture, the yard related materials and things, and it can really give you a nice boost. So we're not seeing that building. In fact, we've actually lowered some of our housing permits, both single family and multifamily, somewhat since last year. And it's a little bit of a puzzle. 2 possible explanations. One, home builders are just more hesitant about not getting too far out on spec homes, etc. The second thing is household formations are not growing. Household formations meaning someone leaves the nest, someone leaves the home and sets up their own apartment. Either people are sticking around with the parents a little longer or the roommates are staying together. And when you don't have that household formation, you don't have that sort of demand that generates the supply.
Let's talk about the general fund revenues. In general, your report indicates there's likely to be a $2 billion of revenues above projections.
In the current year, which we're now in.
Right. And the biggest source of general fund revenues, 2/3, come from personal income taxes. So some of those sources of personal income tax are pretty stable, wages and things like that. Other sources, like capital gains we're talking about, are quite volatile. How did you arrive at your wage and capital gains projections?
Well, and it's good that you point out the personal income tax. We used to think of the state having three major taxes, the big three. Really, we have the big one now. Personal income taxes are 2/3 of our
what were the
revenues.
other two of the big three?
Corporate taxes and the sales and use tax.
So now
the sales
it's
tax.
personal income tax.
Personal income is the big one. It's 2/3. And you're right. Wage income, just people that get their salaries, they don't tend to change a lot from year to year. There's not a lot of volatility in that. That's relatively easy to forecast. If you know what the economy's doing, you kind of know what wage income is going to do. The capital gains is obviously heavily dependent not only on the financial markets, the stock market, but also on housing markets like we just talked about. Prices going up rapidly or can come down rapidly. And so estimating capital gains is very difficult to do, particularly in the longer run.
You know, I think it was kind of interesting when I was reading your report, I think it was in your report, it was saying that capital gains projections are $12 billion. And if you take a look at the state budget, which is about $112 billion, 10% of the state budget, approximately, is capital gains. That's a big part.
And it's paid primarily by high-income taxpayers who pay at the very highest marginal tax rates. And they generate, the top 1% of people generate over half of our personal income taxes.
That's substantial. Well, another source we were talking about a moment ago was the sales and use taxes. They bring in about $22 billion into the state budget. How much are they expected to grow?
You know, we have sales taxes growing, moderately well, sort of we were talking about revenues growing at maybe underlying revenues growing at 4.5%, and sales taxes are humming along at a fairly moderate rate.
You know, you've got Prop 30, which had added a quarter-cent sales tax. That's going to end in 2016. What impact is that going to have on revenues?
Well, you have the sales tax ending in 16, and you have the personal income tax rates ending in 2018. And so I think you heard a lot of people talking about what happens when Prop 13 triggers off. Are we going to have this big cliff effect where revenues fall off? But because they're going off at different times, they have the effect of phasing out over 4 fiscal years. And so it really just results in slower growth
pumping
each
the
year.
brakes.
It's a very gradual, and I think that was a very smart thing because you don't really have these major cliff effects.
Okay, well, up next, we're going to take a look at the other side of the ledger, state spending. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Mac Taylor, California's nonpartisan legislative analyst and the authoritative voice on the state budget. So we've talked about state revenues. Let's talk about state spending. Now, people are sometimes surprised to learn that education represents the biggest state budget, biggest expense of the state budget, around 40 to 50%. Pretty substantial. So your projections for education spending in the budget are what?
Well, 40% roughly is for K-12 and community colleges. And
then you got to add UC and CSU on top of that.
And the only reason we separate it out is because you got the Prop 98 funding formula that tends to determine what we spend on the community colleges and K-12, whereas the universities and financial aid, the legislature has a lot more discretion over what it spends for that. With regard to the universities and financial aid, we have it growing actually pretty substantially. We assume that the legislature would continue to fund along the lines of what the governor has proposed, 4% increases throughout the period. That's just an assumption, obviously, that can change. On Prop 98, it continues to do, it does very well in 14-15 and in 15-16. It has a lot of new ongoing resources. It probably does better than any other segment of the budget. After that, in the out years, it doesn't grow as rapidly, in part because of those Proposition 30 revenues triggering off, but it still has $2.5 billion of growth each year.
We've got the Prop 30 taxes, the temporary taxes. People are wondering if they really are temporary, but allegedly temporary taxes phasing out over the next few years. But meanwhile, you've got some things phasing in. like the local control funding formula and the increased costs for CalSTRS, those rate increases that are paying for teacher pensions. What is the effect of all this on the state budget?
Well, the local control funding formula and the increases have to be handled within whatever the minimum guarantee is. So if the money's available, you can go faster in sort of getting to the targets that the legislature set out under that new funding formula. And then the CalSTRS, or state teachers retirement system, increases. The schools are going to have to bear a quite significant increase in costs related to that. We're estimating, for example, that between this current year and the end of our forecast period, 2019-20, that the schools will have over $11 billion more in annual funding by the end of that period.
Wow.
That seems like a lot, and it's a pretty good increase. Within that, they're going to have to absorb over $3 billion in just additional costs
not so
related
much.
to the state teacher system. So
Okay.
that's taking a chunk of their growth, but they still have quite a bit of new resources that they'll have to spend.
You know, let's kind of turn our attention to higher education for a second. A lot of talk about tuition hikes at UC, University of California. What are the implications for the state budget if those tuition hikes go forward? And what are the implications for the state budget if they don't go forward?
Well, the easier one is if they don't go forward. You had the governor and the legislature, at least last year, had said we want to have these annual increases but no tuition increases. So if they don't go forward, the legislature and the governor can just fund UC however it wants to, whether it's at those levels of 4% a year or whatever amount it wants. If they go through with the increase or propose to increase tuition, it's not clear what happens. The legislature could just fund them as they were going to fund them, and then UC could impose the tuition, and the system would have more money, right? Because the two sources of funding our instructional programs at the University of California are tuitions paid by families and students and general fund money.
Okay, but they could also do a zero-sum situation. If UC gets more money through tuitions, the state could say, maybe less money we appropriate through the legislature.
They could certainly do that.
So you're at zero.
Then you're at zero as far as the overall system is concerned,
Right.
but if the legislature wants to exert its control, that would in fact be an option. So it's a little hard to say if they do go through with it, what happens.
We don't know at
We
this
don't
point.
know.
Okay, politics. Another thing I want to talk about was the significant expansion in Medi-Cal brought about by the Affordable Care Act. How is that going to impact the state budget?
You know, surprisingly, not as much as one might think. A lot of the expansion was to low-income adults, and the federal government right now is paying the entire cost of that. So there's not really a hit on the budget. Now, we are experiencing some costs because people that we have to pay half of the health care cost on, those numbers are growing because of Obamacare, federal health care reform. But the feds are also giving us some greater money for some children who are low income, and so the budgetary effect is surprising not as much as some people might imagine.
Okay. What about CalWORKs? A lot of people refer to that as welfare, another name for welfare. General improvement in the economy, things are doing better. So shouldn't those costs be going down?
We certainly have that in our fiscal outlook, Mark, that if you look on our out years, they go down by, I think on average, 10% a year from the high that we've experienced in this last year to 1920. So we reflect our estimates of continued economic growth. More people would come off the rolls.
Okay, let's talk about corrections and rehabilitation. You got realignment going on. You've got the passage of Prop 47 in November, which reduced some nonviolent crimes, felonies to misdemeanors. What impact on state spending?
Well, Proposition 47, which the people just approved, would probably lower our state prison costs by $200 million a year beginning next year. So not a dramatic effect on a $9 billion budget. But if you do look at our estimates for the out years, our prison-related costs grow very slowly, in part because you have those offsetting savings from things like Proposition 47 and realignment.
Okay, well, up next, what impact will the state's new and improved rainy day fund have on the state budget? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. In November, the voters passed Prop 2, a more restrictive and robust rainy day fund. What are the short and long-term implications? We're talking to Mac Taylor, head of the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office. So what were some of the key changes brought about by the passage of Prop 2?
Well, it every year requires monies to be set aside in order to pay off debts and build up reserves. And there's kind of two pieces of those set-asides. There's an automatic 1.5% of revenues, so about $1.5 billion each year. And then there's an amount that's dependent on whether we're doing very well on capital gains. So you talked about this volatile revenue source. When they're above average, we take more money off the table and we put it into this pot and we divide it with those 1.5% of revenues. You take both of them together and you spend half on reserves, half on paying down debts.
Okay. Well, you indicated, though, there's going to be some key choices that are going to have to be made when it comes to implementing Prop 2. One of them has to do with this $1.6 billion that was deposited in the rainy day fund for 14-15, but may or may not be covered by Prop 2 on these more restrictive rules. What do you think should be done with the money?
Well, it is kind of a technical issue on whether the rules of Proposition 2 apply to it or whether the legislature has a little more flexibility over the control of it. But I think you raised the more important issue. You remember that $4.2 billion number we talked about earlier about the reserve that we're forecasting? Right. The 1.6 is part of that. And so whether you have a lot of control or you're more limited, we think that you should shoot for that $4.2 billion reserve because we think it's going to be needed.
Now that wall of debt's kind of taking care of those issues that need to be filled.
But this 4.2 is more your reserve that you would use to protect against a downturn in revenues.
Okay,
it's not for the debt.
Okay,
that's a whole nother pot of money.
Okay. Well, you've stated in your report, quote, by using the Prop 2 debt payment funds to tackle large, persistent debts over the next 15 years, the state's policymakers can ensure more budget flexibility for the general fund in the long term, unquote. So what kinds of debts are eligible? Let's talk about that for Prop 2.
Well, Proposition 2 that the voters just approved last month was very specific. You can pay off certain budgetary liabilities, like we've made some special fund loans. We've had some monies that we owe local governments for state mandates. And the biggest piece, though, is unfunded liabilities related to any retirement-related benefits.
And those have been substantial. People have talked about that for years.
Tens of billions of dollars.
Yeah. Okay. I've also read that you're suggesting that the legislature develop a plan for the use of Prop 2 funds. How novel a plan. So what should the plan look like?
Well, there's no one right plan, Mark, I think, but you have 15 years where on average you could have $2.5 billion a year. And so we're just suggesting that you approach this a little more methodically than just on a year-to-year ad hoc basis. For example, the one retirement liability that we're not addressing at all is our state retiree health benefits. It's completely pay-as-you-go. And we're suggesting that the legislature might want to give that high priority of using some of those, maybe 13 years worth of those debt payments to really make important inroads in getting our retiree health liabilities addressed.
So explain for folks, why is pay-as-you-go not a good idea? You're paying it, but why is it not really as effective and efficient as putting money aside?
Well, there's sort of the generational issue of you have people that had the service being provided by those employees and they're having their children and future generations pay for them. That's not good public policy. But it's also very expensive. When you pay as the benefits are accrued, you can put it into a fund that earns interest, and then it's much less expensive over time. So we think that we should go, just as we do for pension programs, we should go to a funded system, and this debt scheme that we have under Prop 2 might allow us to build up enough money to pay off most of those unfunded liabilities.
So I think the key point is that you want the money to work for you, and if you set some money aside, you can get some interest on that money, and it actually makes it less expensive to pay that benefit. Exactly. So it's short-term, pay me now or pay me later.
And obviously, if you pay it for those liabilities, they're not available for other things that many members of the legislature would like to spend on.
Yeah, looking at your budget report, it's obviously very challenging to put together a long-term, budget outlook. And you've got to focus on different kinds of scenarios. So what are the kinds of scenarios that you look at when you're trying to make this determination?
Well, we sort of do a main economic scenario, which is based on sort of continued moderate growth throughout. But we realize that that's just one of many possible outcomes. And so in order to help the legislature, we did a alternative hypothetical slowdown. And what we said is, what if in 2016 the market dropped by 20% and you had some economic slowdown? Not a recession, just a slowdown. And whereas we were predicting operating surpluses of $4 billion a year, again on that $107 billion base in the general fund, that turns into operating deficits of a couple of billion a year. And the reserves that we would build up, that $4.2 billion, could help you get by for a year. But then it turns into negative operating deficits. And that's why it's so important in our view to build up those reserves as high as possible.
What if there's a surge though? What if there's a revenue surge?
Well, we also think that we could get more capital gains money right now than what is assumed under our main economic scenario. And ironically, because that bumps up your Proposition 98 on an ongoing basis where it's more of a temporary surge, you actually end up in slightly worse condition than under our main economic scenario.
It's counterintuitive when you think about it. But I want to thank Mac Taylor from the Legislative Analyst Office for being with us today. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free award-winning e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org.
And now, another perspective.
As it does every fall, the Fiscal Outlook released by the Legislative Analyst Office has set the tone and backdrop for next year's budget battle in Sacramento. Just a few years ago and throughout the decade of the 2000s, these reports brought ominous news about the state's financial condition and made state and local policymakers cringe. It's worth remembering that in Governor Brown's first year in office in 2011, the state faced a $25 billion deficit. Now here we are with a $4 billion surplus projected for the end of the next fiscal year. This bust-to-boom cycle has been a common occurrence in California and other states. It is caused by an unstable tax system that relies heavily on personal income taxes, the most highly volatile of tax sources, and less on more stable sources of revenue like sales and property tax. So what should state lawmakers do now with the rosier budget circumstances? Well, voters took a step forward in the November election with the passage of a new rainy day fund. This helps the state save some of the expected surplus to avoid large budget cuts when the next economic recession hits and decreases revenue. If history is our guide, then that next recession is not too far off. That rainy day fund will help us weather the storm, but it will probably not be large enough to avoid some significant budget cuts. Although Proposition 30 helped the state avoid further deficits, the high tax rates it imposed are not good tax policy. Instead of simply extending Proposition 30, the other thing that state policymakers should do with the improved financial outlook is reform the volatile tax system. This is no easy task and will invite partisan attacks from both sides. No overhaul of our state tax system has occurred since the 1930s. But if we want to avoid the severe boom and bust cycles that we have seen in the past, then our tax system must adapt to our modern economy. This does not have to mean simply raising taxes to generate more revenue. Rather, the tax reform package should be revenue neutral, where it lowers some tax rates, such as the sales tax, and subjects more things to taxes like services. The governor and legislators have already tackled some significant issues, including the water bond, rainy day fund, and public pensions. Let's see what they can do about tax reform. I'm Jeff Cummins for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.